Good morning. It is time to start. Great to see everybody here. We're going to start out with a prayer, and Tom would lead us in that prayer. Amen. So we got a call or a text or something from Jonathan that he couldn't be here today. I don't know why. I didn't get that part of the message. So we needed a one-off lesson. He didn't want anybody to try and pick up where he left off, which that's fine with me, because this is ringing. I don't know if you guys can tell it, but for me it's really ringing. I thought, since we're studying Ephesus, but we don't want to have a lesson from Ephesus, why don't we look at how Ephesus became the church that it is? So, obviously we have to go to Acts, and we'd like to start in Acts chapter 18. Okay, so right off the bat, we have the map of Paul's first missionary journey. And you can see he didn't get anywhere near Ephesus on his first missionary journey. He did a... What? No, I'll tell you. He just did a loop through Asia Minor. He went in, he came back out, and that was his first missionary journey. Now you can go second missionary journey. You can swap to the second missionary journey. Well, anyway, they'll get that. It's a much larger area that he covered. And you see that the line, when we get the line up there, that it did go to Ephesus. But we're going to read a little bit and find out exactly what his interaction was during his second missionary journey. So if we start at Acts 18:18. Now, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Actually, if we look back up just a few verses up to verse 11, he says, so Paul stayed for a year and a half. So during the second missionary journey of Paul, he stayed in Corinth for a year and a half. Then he leaves Corinth and goes to Ephesus. And we go, okay, Ephesus, all right, the church in Ephesus, here we go. But let's read a couple verses. Then he left the brother, I'm back in 18. Chapter 18, verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time, a year and a half. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, "I will come back if it is God's will." Then he set sail from Ephesus. So it sounds like he spent one day in Ephesus. He did not found a church in Ephesus. He went in and had an afternoon's conversation in the synagogue, which we know that was what he did pretty much everywhere he went. He would always go to the synagogue and talk to the Jews first, bring the gospel to the Jews first. That's what he did everywhere he went. So on his second missionary journey, he was in Ephesus a few hours. Now, as we know, that's not exactly definitive. It sounds like he was only there one day, but from the jumps that happen in Luke's writings, he could have been there a few days, and that's just a synopsis of what happened. We don't know. It's just so many times Luke will say one sentence, and then you find out from supporting evidence that covered 3 years. So it sounds like he was only there one day. Now, I wanted to back up because we get all these lessons. I call them throwaway lessons, and I know that's a terrible nomenclature for these things that happen, but where something is mentioned, it's not what they were teaching, but it's just mentioned. And it makes me say, what? So let's back up. We'll go back to verse 18. The end of that verse. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. Now, we also know that when he went to Jerusalem much later, years later, that one of the things the Christians in Jerusalem asked him to do was to take a vow with some other men and to pay for all their expenses to take this vow. You know, what expenses? Get a haircut? Well, we have to look back. Yes?
Well, the Jewish vow, some of the last 8 days, some of the last 30 days. If you had to take a vow, you had to have someone pay your expenses. They had to bring you food and water for that day. You couldn't leave the temple grounds. You'd have your hair cut off. You'd spend all your days in prayer. But sometime during that day, you had to eat. So you had to have someone bring you food and water into the temple grounds. And then you had to go outside in the common area to eat, and then you could go return back into the temple to continue your vow. But it depended. Most Jewish vows were 8 days, and some of them were 30 days. So it was really a stringent, depends on which vow you took.
Okay, so, and that's correct. We want to go back and actually look at the rules for vows, because I know when I'm in classes, we talk about them, we kind of say, well, it's the Nazirite vow, and we never spend any time on the actual Nazirite vow, and the expense is tremendous. That was like a spoiler warning there, or I should have given you a spoiler warning. The expense was incredible. So it's in Numbers chapter 6. It's 20 verses, so it's kind of a long reading. That's another thing, we avoid that a lot, is long readings, but we're going to do it. So we're in Numbers chapter 6. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow," so a man or a woman could do this, "a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazirite, he must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or from other fermented drinks. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as he is a Nazirite, he must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins." Okay, I think he's pretty clear. Can't have anything from a grapevine while you're under this vow. Now, I know as a child, they would always use these verses here to prove that you couldn't drink wine. But if these prove that, they also prove you can't eat raisins or have vinegar. So it was a misuse of the verse. Okay, verse 5. I'm going to pick up again. Numbers chapter 6, verse 5. "During the entire period of this vow of separation, no razor may be used on his head. He must be holy until the period of the separation to the Lord is over. He must let the hair of his head grow long. Throughout the period of his separation to the Lord, he must not go near a dead body. Even if his own father or mother or brother or sister dies, he must not make himself ceremonially unclean on account of them, because the symbol of his separation to God is on his head. Throughout the period of the separation, he is consecrated to the Lord." Again, just another lesson on the side. It's not what they were teaching, but they started out, they said a man or a woman could take this vow. It's completely voluntary. You could live your whole life and never take this vow, and that would be fine. It was not a requirement of your heritage or of your religion that you ever take this vow. It's completely voluntary. They said either men could do it or women can do it. Then when they go to explain the details, they always say he. It's always what the man should do. Simply because they already set the standard, it's men or women, and rather than saying he or she do this, he or she do that, they just go with the he. It cuts out a lot of stumbling over yourself trying to define which pronoun you're talking about. So they told us it's male and female. Then when they actually do the whole rest of the writing, they just mention the male. And you can say or she every time you has the word he in there if you want, but you don't need to. All right. If someone dies suddenly in his presence, thus defiling the hair he has dedicated, he must shave his head on the day of his cleansing, the seventh day. That's where we were getting the 8 days. It was common, if you took the vow, kind of the minimum amount was 8 days, because it took that much time just to do what was required to take the vow. You had to show yourself to the priest, you had to get your head shaved, you had to dedicate yourself, and if you did the minimum vow, which was usually 8 days, yeah, you stayed in the temple, or you could stay in the temple. You didn't have to, but that became tradition. You know, after 1,000 years of this, traditions spring up. You just can't help it. And people felt like, well, I'm more holy if I stay in the temple. And then, yes, then somebody's got to bring you food, unless you're going to do the whole thing fasting. There may have been somebody that did that, but basically somebody had to bring your food if you're going to stay in the temple. However, as we'll see as we read, there's no requirement that you stay in the temple. That just became a tradition, that's how they did it. You could go on with your life, which You'd kind of have to. Samson was a Nazirite. He didn't stay in the temple. But he also had a lifetime commitment to this. Most people had a set time. 8 days was the most common, evidently. But you could say, I'm going to do it for a year. I'm going to do it for 5 years. It was totally up to you how long the vow lasted. But you did have to state at the beginning how long it was going to last. And then you had to do it. Now, as we just heard here, for the whole time that you're under the vow, absolutely nothing from a grapevine. Not leaves, not seeds, not grape juice, not wine, not vinegar, nothing from the grapevine for however long you took the vow. You started the vow getting your head shaved, men and women, both. When you start the vow, you shave your head. Now, you would know when you saw somebody with a shaved head, you would probably, well, they must be doing a vow. Because, especially for a woman to shave her head, that was a shame. That was one of the ways that you showed adultery, was you shaved her head, and then she was shamed that her head was shaved. So you'd have to either assume or ask. It's not like it was a secret vow. You weren't forbidden to tell people, oh yeah, I'm taking a vow. But still, when somebody showed up with their head shaved, everybody would notice, and it would help you break into this vow thing, because there are requirements. For one thing, not having any grape juice was tough to do in that society. That was the main thing they drank, was grape juice, or water with some grape juice in it, or water with some grape wine in it. If you had water with a little wine in it, that tended to clean the water. So that was the main thing they drank, was highly, highly diluted wine. Could not come in contact with the dead body. And it's so funny that they answer right away, because you're going, well, yeah, but what if mom dies? No. Doesn't matter who it is that dies. You cannot come in contact with a dead body. Then they answer another objection right away before anybody even makes it. Well, what if somebody dies right next to me? You broke your vow. Well, let's see what the consequences of that are. If someone dies suddenly in his presence, I'm on verse 9. Someone dies suddenly in his presence, thus defiling the hair he has dedicated, he must shave his head on the day of his cleansing, the 7th day. So, I'm in a crowd. I'm in the 4th year of my 5-year vow. The hair that's on my head, which is now 4 years old, is dedicated to God. To me, that's a funny way of thinking of it. It's the hair that's dedicated to God. Somebody drops dead beside me in a crowd, I just broke my vow. I didn't mean to break my vow. It had nothing to do with it. But evidently, I have to do something for 7 days. And I think it's going back to the temple and maybe even living in the temple for those 7 days. It doesn't really say. They assume we know this, and they don't spell it out. But it is 7 days later, I get my head shaved again. So I took a 4-year vow. It was totally voluntary. At the beginning of that vow, I had my head shaved. And the plan is, at the end of 4 years, I will go and show myself to the priest. I'll make some sacrifices, and they'll shave my head again. And that hair is the symbol of this vow that I've taken. The hair. And then we're going to find out what they have to do with the hair. But the point is, if I'm 3 years into my 4-year vow and somebody drops dead beside me, in 7 days after that happened, I have to shave my head again.
So there's part of it is not only living a long vow, part of it is any Jew, person, children of Israel, that came in contact with a dead person was now unclean.
Yes, that,
And one, it didn't matter if it was a total stranger or a family member. To become unclean, there was ritual requirement to become clean again. So not only does it talk about the Nazarite vow and things, but because they're unclean, they now have to become clean again in the process.
right, and that was what they call ceremonially unclean. And there were all kind of things that could happen to make you ceremonially unclean. And one of them was being in contact with a dead body. And that wasn't just human bodies, animals. Now, the good news is some of them, if you killed a squirrel and gutted it and cooked it, all you had to do was wash your hands to become clean again. But some things, this is really ringing. Some things, like if you were walking in the field and you came by a dead cow, well, now you can't just wash your hands. You had stuff you had to do beyond just washing your hands before you could be clean again. And so you walk back home, you come to your house and you go, ceremonially unclean. It was almost like the leprosy thing where they had to yell, unclean, unclean, except, you're coming to your own house, but you want your whole family to know, I'm ceremonially unclean. Well, they can't come and hug you, or they're going to be ceremonially unclean. Usually it was for one day. It's like once the night passed, it's all good. We're all over again. But you had to wash. You had to not touch anybody for that day, and then by the next day you'd be okay in most cases. It's a real interesting read of all these unclean things that you had to do. But in just typical society, if you lived in a city, an Israelite city, it would just be so common. You'd see a friend, you go hi, and they go hi, and you go up to them, they go, unclean. And you knew, okay, well, we can't hug. We can't shake hands. Or you could, and then you would be unclean. So it's your choice. How much do I want to hug that person? If I haven't seen them for weeks, maybe I want to hug them anyway and then say, which unclean are we? And you're hoping it's one of those that it'll all be better the next day. And if you find out that it's one that's going to take you 7 days, you might go, oh, I shouldn't have hugged you. But it would happen all the time, unclean. You didn't have to shout it, but you had to make sure before you made physical contact that you told that person, yeah, I'm unclean. What happened? I said, walking on a trail, I stepped on a dead rabbit. Okay. Stepped on a dead rabbit. You're ceremonially unclean. When the Jews walked by the Jews walked by the brother Jew that was beaten up. And the Good Samaritan stopped and helped him. So we know that story. One of the reasons they would have walked around the guy that they thought was dead is they would have been ceremonially unclean, and they were going to Jerusalem to perform their priestly duties. If you show up to perform your priestly duties and you're ceremonially unclean, you can't do your priestly duties. There's no way around it. You can't suddenly wash your hands really good and be declared clean. You can't. There's no way around it. So if they had touched this bleeding man they're taking upon themselves the fact that they're ceremonially unclean, they're gonna be that way for at least a day, and I'm not real sure of the rules, if it was a day or if this is one of the 7-day things. I think if he turned out to be dead, I'm pretty sure it would be the 7-day thing. So that's one of the parts of the story that we don't know, because it was not our culture, but I've heard people talk about it. That was a very compelling reason for them to not get involved with this person that they thought was dead, because they were going to Jerusalem, the priest and the Levite. You had a schedule to keep, and you knew that on the 5th day of every 4th month, that's my day in the temple. That's the day I do whatever it is I do. And you didn't want to show up there unclean. So, just the thing. All right, sorry. Let's get going. Okay, so verse 10. On the 8th day he must bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. You're going, all right, I can afford 2 doves. I can do that. Okay. The priest is to offer one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering to make atonement for him, because he sinned by being in the presence of the dead body. That's not fair. You were just in the presence of a dead body. It wasn't your fault. It's counted as sin. And it's counted as breaking your vow. That same day he is to consecrate his head. He must dedicate himself to the Lord for the period of his separation, and must bring a year-old male lamb as a guilt offering. Okay, it just got a little more expensive. Now I have to buy a lamb. Or if I'm a farmer or a rancher and I have my own lambs, I have to bring one of those. Has to be a 1-year-old, and it has to be spotless. The previous days do not count because he became defiled during his separation. It wasn't my fault the guy next to me in line had a heart attack. I was 3 years into my 4-year commitment. He just died. I didn't do anything. I have to go. I have to buy 2 doves and a lamb. They have to be sacrificed. I have to shave my head and start over. I am now at the beginning of a 4-year separation. Why? Because I voluntarily said I want to do this. So now your 4-year term ended up being a 7-year term. Verse 13, now this is the law for the Nazirite when the period of his separation is over. He is to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting. There he is to present his offering to the Lord, a year-old male lamb without defect for a burnt offering, a year-old ewe lamb without defect for a sin offering, a ram without defect for a fellowship offering. This is expensive. When you think of an agrarian society, a lamb, a ewe lamb, and a ram is a very significant amount of investment. If it's your own flock, that's one thing, but if you don't have those, you have to purchase them. That's a fair lot of money. Okay, the burnt offering gets burnt, the sin offering gets burnt, the fellowship offering gets cooked. So that's one of the significant things that happens here. What is it? Year lamb, a ram. Okay, the ram is going to be eaten, and generally at the end of a Nazirite vow, it was kind of a party. And especially if you took one for more than just the 8-day minimum. If you took a longer vow, people knew, oh, he's finally getting near the end of his vow. In my case, for some reason, I said 4 years. I just made it up, so I don't know why. What was my reasoning for that? But people would do it for 7 years, 12 years, 1 year, or 8 days, or 2 weeks. I mean, you could pick any time, whatever was significant to you, but you're trying to show to God your dedication. So, in my case, we picked 4 years, just as an example. At the end of my 4 years, which, oh, by the way, turned into 7 years, all my family knows I'm finally at the end of this vow. Some of my friends know I'm finally at the end of the vow. We're going to have a barbecue. And that's where the ram comes in, because it's a fellowship offering, which means parts of it are cut out and burnt to a crisp, but parts of it are cooked and eaten. Okay, not only that, and drink offerings, and a basket of bread made without yeast, cakes made of fine flour mixed with oil, and wafers spread with oil. Now, I've never had any of that stuff, so I don't know what cakes made with fine flour and oil really are, except for when we have unleavened bread and somebody actually takes a recipe and makes it themselves. That's been, I think it's the fine flour and oil. I think that's what we're having. So you had to bring a basket full of that. The priest is to present them before the Lord and make the sin offering and the burnt offering. He is to present the basket of unleavened bread and is to sacrifice the ram as a fellowship offering to the Lord, together with its grain offering and drink offering. That means the ram and the drink offering and that basket of bread are to be eaten. It's a fellowship offering. That means they get to eat that. You don't just put it in the fire and burn it up. Then at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the Nazarite must shave off the hair that he dedicated. He is to take the hair and put it in the fire that is under the sacrifice of the fellowship offering. Okay, so now we're getting into what happens to that hair. That the hair has been dedicated to the Lord. If you can imagine, if you had 4 years of growth shaved off, it'd be a pretty nice amount. More for some, less for others. Okay, verse 19. After the Nazarite has shaved off the hair of his dedication, the priest is to place in his hands a boiled shoulder of the ram and a cake and a wafer from the basket, both made without yeast. The priest shall then wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. They are holy and belong to the priest, together with the breast that was waved and the thigh that was presented. After that, the Nazarite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazarite who vows his offering to the Lord in accordance with his separation, in addition to whatever else he can afford. He must fulfill the vow he has made according to the law of the Nazarite. So, when Paul later on is told, oh, go up to the temple and make a vow and take, was it 2 or 3 guys with him and pay for them too? Does anybody remember if it was 2 or 3? Let's say it was 3, because I can't remember, and I didn't look it up. I didn't think that far. That means he's got to buy 8 doves, 4 one-year-old lambs, 4 one-year-old ewe lambs, and 4 rams. And the drink offering, which is grape juice, and 4 baskets of bread. Paul had to pay for all that. He's a traveling preacher. How how could he even do that? Okay, but that's what he had to do, and that was later on. That was in Jerusalem. But this is the vow of the Nazarite. It did become stylized. It did have traditions built up around it, so that the 8-day version became very popular and ended up with his own rules. But as you see from what we read, those rules are not written down in the Torah. They were traditions that were built up around it. There's nothing about staying in the temple. But by the time 2,000 years later, it was a very strict setup that you had to do if you did the 8-day version. Okay. Yes?
Role, that it was a history or a testimony as to how you lived those 8 days or 10 years or whatever it was.
Or whatever it was. Yeah, your hair was a chemical record of all that you did. Okay, so now let's jump back into Acts. Chapter 18. Okay, and we read 18 through 21. So now we're on verse 22 of chapter 18. When he landed at Caesarea... Oh, wait a minute. Let me read 21 again. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. All right, this is the end of the second missionary journey. So, he sailed from Ephesus about 800 miles to Caesarea, and then he went to Antioch. Now, this is the southern Antioch. Or not. No, okay. No, he went up to that one. All right, so he spent his time in Antioch, where they were first called Christians in Antioch. We know that. So a lot of foot travel, a couple hundred miles of walking. Now, verse 23. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from here and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening disciples. All right, so Paul went to Antioch. Now, what are we on? We're on the second missionary journey. Let's flip to the third missionary journey now. No. Oh, okay. Well, it's essentially the same till we get that map up. So, meanwhile, that's okay, we got time because I got a little paragraph here. Verse 24. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. That, to me, is really tough. It's been 17 years since the founding of the church, since the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. 17 years. And we have a Jew who is very knowledgeable, who is in Ephesus. He ended up in Ephesus, and he does pretty much the same thing Paul does. He goes into the synagogue, he talks to people, and he preaches Jesus, except he didn't know Jesus. He had heard John the Baptist, been baptized by John the Baptist, and then went on his merry way, and for 17 years, somehow, never heard about what happened after he left. All he knew was the Jewish nation was supposed to be preparing the way for the Messiah. And evidently that's what he was teaching. Y'all need to repent because Messiah is coming. And he'd been evidently teaching that for 17 years. It's amazing to me. You'd think he would have found out. Okay, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, now that's the whole area where, all right. So he's in Ephesus. This whole area is Achaia, so it includes Corinth. Wrote the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. So sometime in the process, he had been taught about Jesus. Because when he got to Ephesus, he didn't know about Jesus. All right, chapter 19. While Apollos was at Corinth, Paul took the road through the interior and arrived at Ephesus. One sentence. Paul walked 500 miles on foot, going through every city that he went through in his first and second missionary journeys. Well, the first ones, the ones that were in the first missionary journey. He never went down to Crete again. Okay, so not everyone. It's a general statement. But in one sentence, he walked 500 miles and saw all his old friends, all his old congregations. I'm sure you couldn't get out of there without speaking a few times and sharing meals with everybody that you knew. And it's just, oh yeah, he did that. Boom. Just like that. And he arrived at Ephesus. There he found some disciples and asked them, "Did you receive the Holy Spirit when you believed?" Now this really ties in. In fact, we talked about this verse specifically. Receiving the Holy Spirit was a huge, big deal because that was the proof, that was the miraculous proof that I'm not just a traveling speaker saying beautiful words. If I can perform a miracle, that proves there's something behind what I'm saying. There's power behind what I'm saying. You need to pay attention. Because anybody could walk into any town and say anything. That can happen today. I've seen it happen. I've seen people come into a congregation and say, "Oh, let me speak." And they could say anything. So I was, totally looking at the clock wrong. I thought I had 10 more minutes, but no, this is the correct time. So that was the founding of the church at Ephesus, because he explained to those dozen men and laid hands on them, and that was really the beginning of the church in Ephesus, was Paul coming back on his third journey. At that point, he spent 2 years, I think it was. We would have got to that, and I didn't make it in my note because we were going to read it. I think it was 2 years. Okay, so thank you. And hopefully Jonathan will be back next week.